My twin sister paid me $200 to pretend to be her on the family vacation, but she forgot to mention her abusive ex-husband would be there, and our parents were planning to lock me in a room with him. My identical twin sister Felicia placed $200 in front of me and said, "I need you to go on the family holiday for me." My family always preferred her company over mine. Please! It overlaps with Jasmine's birthday party. Ugh, fine, but last swap, and I mean it this time. I didn't know it at the time, but Felicia's abusive ex-husband was coming on the trip, and he was going to do whatever it took to win her back. The resort looked like something from a Christmas card, but day 2 brought the interrogation. 2 years is a long time to be single, Grandma started. Since Richard, Aunt Linda continued. I giggled nervously like Felicia would. I'm focusing on myself. Mom cleared her throat. He reached out to us recently. Did he? He's in therapy. Real therapy, not court-ordered. He broke my ribs. I didn't even have to fake my anger. You tripped. He said you tripped. Uncle Pete leaned forward. Men make mistakes. That's what makes them grow. The conversation spiraled. Suddenly, every incident became a misunderstanding. Every bruise was clumsiness. Every police report was an overreaction. What they didn't mention was the other woman who reported him. You see, 6 months ago, Richard was accused of sexual assault again. The charges were dropped in just a few days. Misunderstanding, his lawyer said. The woman looked just like Felicia. I'd seen the news article. We all did. Yet here they were, tearing apart Felicia's trauma like a pack of wolves. But I'd seen the truth. I held Felicia's hair back while she threw up blood in the hospital parking lot, too scared to go inside because they'll ask questions. I taught her how to use concealer on bruises that wrapped around her throat like a necklace. That afternoon, I escaped to the spa. That's when I smelled it. His cologne. That specific brand that used to make Felicia vomit. Just a trace in the elevator. My knees went weak. Day 3, more cologne, stronger. In the hallway near our rooms. I started mapping the resort differently. Not where the pool was or the gym, where the stairwells were, which doors locked, which windows opened. That's when I caved and texted Felicia. Something's wrong. What kind of wrong? They keep mentioning Richard, and I smell his cologne everywhere. I could practically feel her panicking through the screen. Get out, now. Can't. They'll know we swapped. I don't care, leave now. But leaving wasn't an option, because that's when my dad appeared at my elbow after dinner, guiding me back toward the rooms. Someone special wants to see you. The hallway seemed longer than before. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure he could hear it. When I slowed down, his grip tightened on my arm. I glanced around in panic and saw Uncle Pete by the elevators, Aunt Linda at the corner. The security guard at the end of the hall saw us coming and suddenly found something very interesting to look at in the opposite direction. 3 years hadn't changed him much. Same build, same hands that knew exactly where to grab. He was already drunk when he cornered me in the kitchen. "Felicia, baby, you've been avoiding me. Your family believes in second chances," he said, smiling. "They understand forgiveness." "Please," I whispered. "Not here." That's when Mom appeared in the doorway. "Richard's staying right next door." Her voice was so bright. "We thought that proximity might help," Aunt Linda finished. His hand on my wrist wasn't a request, and my family weren't watching. They were hurting. Room 353. The door clicked shut. Then Mom did something I'll never forgive. She locked it from the outside. "1 hour," she called through the door. "Really talk things through." His mask dropped before her footsteps even faded. "You ruined everything," he slurred, backing me against the wall. The restraining order, telling everyone lies about me. He pulled out his phone, swiping through photos of Felicia I knew she hadn't sent him. Recent ones. "Your mom's been very helpful." Before I could even speak, his fist slammed next to my head, close enough that I felt the wind from it. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" The vein in his temple throbbed the way it always did before things got bad, and I knew I only had a few seconds before his anger went beyond verbal. His next swing came fast, and I dropped straight to the floor, rolling hard toward the bed while his fist hit the wall where my head had been. The impact made him stumble forward, drunk and off balance, and I scrambled to put the bed frame between us, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear him cursing. I grabbed the bedside lamp with both hands and held it up like a baseball bat, backing slowly toward the bathroom door. "Richard, you're drunk, and this is being recorded," I lied, my shaking fingers finding my phone in my back pocket. He laughed and lunged straight across the bed at me. I swung the lamp as hard as I could and caught his shoulder with a solid crack. The base shattered into pieces, but he kept coming, not even slowing down, and I knew I needed something better fast. I turned and ran for the bathroom, slamming the door just as his body crashed into it. My fingers fumbled with the lock while he pounded and screamed about what he'd do when he got in. I hit record on my phone with shaking hands, catching every threat he was yelling through the door. Then I heard Mom's voice in the hallway asking if everything was okay. Richard's voice changed instantly, calm and controlled. "We're working things out." Mom actually said, "Good, that's good," and her footsteps moved away down the hall. My stomach dropped as I typed out a text to Felicia with trembling fingers. 353, help now. Richard started kicking the door, and the cheap hotel lock bent with each impact. The whole frame was shaking, and I could see the screws starting to pull out of the wall. The door frame cracked and splintered near the lock. I grabbed the heavy porcelain toilet tank lid, the only weapon I could find. When Richard's hand reached through the broken door to unlock it from inside, I brought the lid down hard on his fingers. He screamed and pulled back, giving me just enough time to shove past him into the main room. But he recovered faster than I expected, his hand shooting out and grabbing a fistful of my hair. He yanked me backwards so hard I saw white spots in my vision. My hands went up automatically, clawing at his face and leaving deep scratches down his cheek. I brought my knee up hard into his groin and he doubled over with a grunt. I ran for the main door, but it only opened 2 inches before the chain stopped it. Mom had installed it from the outside. I pressed my face to the gap and screamed as loud as I could. "Help! Someone help me!" A woman walking by in the hallway looked right at me through the gap, then quickly looked away and kept walking. Richard was already getting back up behind me, one hand on his bleeding face and the other reaching for me again. I yanked on the door chain, but it wouldn't budge. The screws were industrial grade, way stronger than anything that should be on a hotel door. My phone was still recording in my pocket, but that wouldn't help me now. Richard grabbed my shoulder and spun me around, slamming me back against the door. His breath smelled like whiskey and rage. "You always make things difficult," he said, wiping blood from the scratches on his face. I tried to duck under his arm, but he blocked me, keeping me pinned against the door. My mind raced through options, but there weren't many. The windows didn't open, the door was chained, and my family was actively helping him. I could hear people walking by in the hallway, normal vacation sounds, while I was trapped in here with him. He grabbed my wrists and pinned them above my head with one hand, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Your mom showed showed me all your recent photos," he said, leaning in close. "You look good, better than before." I tried to knee him again, but he saw it coming and turned his hip to block it. "3 years and you still fight the same way," he said. That's when I heard my phone buzz in my pocket, Felicia texting back, but I couldn't reach it with my hands pinned. Richard heard it too, and his free hand went for my pocket. I twisted hard to the side and managed to get one hand free, immediately going for his eyes. He jerked his head back and lost his grip on my other wrist. I shoved him as hard as I could and ran for the kitchenette area, putting the small counter between us. There were knives in the drawer, but he was already coming around the counter. I grabbed a glass from the drying rack and threw it at his head. He ducked and it shattered against the wall behind him. "Stop making this harder than it needs to be," he said, but his voice was getting angrier. I kept backing up, keeping furniture between us, but the room wasn't that big, and I was running out of space. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Felicia was probably freaking out, but there was nothing she could do from wherever she was. Richard feinted left, then went right, and I barely dodged his grab. His fingers caught my shirt and ripped it at the shoulder. I grabbed another lamp from the side table and held it up, but we both knew how well that worked last time. Richard moved faster than I expected, and suddenly his arm was around my throat from behind, cutting off my air. I couldn't breathe, and my vision started going dark around the edges, so I did the only thing I could think of, and bit down on his forearm as hard as I could. The taste of blood filled my mouth, and it was warm and metallic and made me want to throw up, but I kept biting until he screamed and let go. While he was cursing and holding his arm, I grabbed a pen from the nightstand and scribbled "Help Room 353" on a piece of resort paper and tried to slide it under the door, but Richard saw what I was doing and tackled me hard to the ground. My head hit the carpet with this awful thud, and everything went fuzzy, and I couldn't focus my eyes for a few seconds. I wonder what Felicia's really running from with this birthday party excuse. $200 seems like a lot just to avoid a family trip. Something tells me there's way more to this swap than just wanting to party with Jasmine, especially with how. Someone knocked on the door right then, asking if everything was okay in there because they heard loud noises. Mom's voice came through clear as day, saying it was just a family disagreement and asking them to please respect our privacy, and I wanted to scream at how she was helping him hurt me. Richard used my dazed state to flip me over and pin me down with his knee pressed into my back so hard I thought my spine would snap. "Felicia always fought back too at first," he said right into my ear, and his breath was hot and smelled like whiskey. I remembered this self-defense move from a class I took years ago and managed to grab his ankle and twist it hard to the side. He fell sideways with a grunt, and I scrambled up as fast as I could and grabbed the coffee maker from the dresser and threw it at his head. It missed and shattered against the wall, but it gave me enough time to put the bed between us again while he was struggling to stand up because his ankle was hurting. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw Felicia's text saying she called the front desk anonymously about a woman screaming in room 353. Richard saw my phone light up, and his eyes got this crazy look, and he lunged across the bed trying to grab it to destroy the evidence. We both grabbed the phone at the same time and were pulling, and I managed to scratch his face really deep with my nails, and I could see 3 red lines appear and start bleeding down his cheek. He backhanded me so hard across the face that I saw actual stars like in cartoons, and my ears were ringing, but I kept my grip on the phone and hit record. The room phone started ringing, and Richard let go of my phone to answer it, and I could hear him telling whoever was calling that everything was fine and there was no problem. I screamed, "He's attacking me," as loud as I could before he slammed the phone down, and I knew whoever was on the other end heard me. Richard picked up the phone receiver and threw it at me, and it caught my temple right above my eyebrow, and I felt the skin split open immediately. I pressed my hand to it, and when I pulled it away, my fingers were covered in warm blood that was already running down the side of my face. Someone started pounding on the door with real authority, and a deep voice said, "Resort security, we need to check on this room." Mom tried to tell them through the door that everything was handled, and it was a private family matter, but the security guy said he had to visually confirm everyone was safe or he'd use his master key. I felt this tiny spark of hope for the first time since the door locked behind me. Richard looked at me with pure hate in his eyes and grabbed my wrist so hard I felt the bones grinding together and pulled me close to whisper that if I said anything, he'd make sure Felicia paid for it later. The door handle started turning, and I could hear the key card beeping, and Richard let go of my wrist and stepped back trying to look calm, even though his face was bleeding from the scratches, and his shirt was torn. The door opened, and this big security guard stepped in, and his eyes went wide when he saw the blood on my face, and the broken coffee maker, and the lamp on the floor, and everything knocked over from our fight. Mom was right behind him saying this was all a misunderstanding, and that I was clumsy and fell, but the security guard wasn't buying it at all. He looked at Richard's scratched face and the bite mark on his arm that was still bleeding, and then at me with blood running down my face and my torn shirt, and he pulled out his radio and called for backup and the resort manager. Richard tried to say we were just having a disagreement that got out of hand, but the security guard told him to sit down and not move while he checked if I needed medical attention. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand, and the security guard helped me sit in the chair by the window and gave me a towel for my bleeding head while we waited for more people to arrive. The door suddenly rattled hard, and I heard more voices outside while Richard paced around the room like a caged animal. He grabbed my arm and pulled me close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath and feel his fingers digging into my skin. His lips were right next to my ear when he whispered that if I said one word about this to anyone, he'd make sure Felicia paid for it later in ways I couldn't imagine. Something inside me snapped, and I looked him straight in the eye and said loud enough for everyone outside to hear that I wasn't Felicia. The security guard was trying to use his master key, but the chain was still on the door, and it only opened about 4 inches. Through that small gap, I could see Rowan from the front desk trying to look inside, and another man in a dark suit who had to be Bennett, the head of security, based on the badge on his jacket. They were both trying to figure out what was happening while Richard started moving toward the door to block their view. I scrambled for my purse on the floor and grabbed my wallet with shaking hands. Richard saw what I was doing and lunged for me, but I managed to shove my driver's license through the door gap before he could stop me. The license landed on the hallway carpet, and Bennett picked it up and looked at it carefully. He held it up to the light and then leaned down to look through the gap at my face, which I knew was bloody from where Richard had hit me. Bennett pulled out his phone immediately, and I heard him telling someone they needed police backup at room 353 right away. Richard tried to reach through the gap to grab the license back, but I kicked his shin as hard as I could, and he stumbled backward, cursing. He recovered fast and shoved me against the wall so hard my head bounced off it, and I saw stars for a second. Mom's voice came through the door saying this was a private family matter that didn't need police involvement, and we were just having a discussion. Bennett's voice was firm when he told her to step aside or she'd be arrested for obstruction of justice. She started arguing about how this was all a misunderstanding, and we were family trying to work things out, but I heard heard another security guard arrive and tell her she needed to move away from the door. She kept saying we were overreacting and making a scene over nothing, but I could hear her footsteps moving away from the door. Richard suddenly stopped pacing and straightened his clothes like nothing had happened. He wiped the blood from the scratches on his face where I'd fought back earlier and smoothed down his hair. Then he started his speech that I knew he'd given 100 times before about how these things were just misunderstandings and how emotional Felicia gets when she's upset. His words were slurring from all the alcohol, and he had to grab the dresser to keep his balance, but he kept talking about how he just wanted to work things out peacefully. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and held it up so he could see the screen. The recording timer was still running and showed 12 minutes and counting. Richard's face went white when he saw it and realized I'd been recording everything, including Mom's voice outside the door dismissing what was happening. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out for once. About 15 minutes later, I heard more voices and the sound of radios crackling in the hallway. Through the gap, I could see a police officer in uniform, and Bennett pointed at the door while explaining the situation. The officer leaned down to look through the gap and introduced himself as Officer Harrison Clark before telling Richard to step back from me and move to the far side of the room. Richard did what he was told, but started his sob story right away about how he was just trying to reconcile with his ex-wife and things got emotional. I interrupted him and explained as clearly as I could that I wasn't Felicia, but her twin sister, and my family had locked me in this room with him against my will. Harrison looked at my driver's license that Bennett was still holding, and then back at me through the gap. He told another officer to get bolt cutters while making sure everyone stayed separated and calm. The other officer came back with a tool and started working on the chain while Harrison kept watching through the gap to make sure Richard stayed where he was. The chain finally snapped with a loud crack, and the door swung open all the way. I tried to stand up and walk out, but my legs were shaking so bad I could barely move, and I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. Harrison caught my arm and helped me out into the hallway where I could finally breathe again. That's when a woman came out of the room next door holding a crumpled piece of paper in her hand, and I recognized her from earlier when we'd passed in the hallway. She walked straight up to Harrison and showed him the paper, and I could see my shaky handwriting that said, "Help room 353, please call police." "I'm Ellie King from 352, she said quickly. "I found this under my door and I heard everything through the wall, including when he hit her." She pointed at the wall between our rooms and then at me, and I noticed her hands were shaking too. Harrison took the paper from her and looked at it carefully, then looked back at me and nodded like he understood everything now. The other officer came over and they started talking quietly while more people showed up, including 2 paramedics with a medical bag who headed straight for me. They sat me down on a bench in the hallway, and one of them shined a light in my eyes while the other one started checking the cut on my temple that was still bleeding. The paramedic cleaned the cut and put butterfly bandages on it, while the other one looked at my throat where I could already feel the bruises forming from Richard's hands. They took pictures of everything, including my face where his fist had connected, and my wrists where he'd grabbed me and twisted them. What's making Richard suddenly try to smooth everything over when he was just attacking her? The way he switches from violent to playing innocent when security shows up tells me he's done this routine before with Felicia. Harrison came back over and asked if I could show him my phone, and I pulled it out with shaking hands and found the recording I'd started when Richard first cornered me. The whole thing was there, including him threatening me and the sounds of the fight and me screaming for help. I also showed him the text between me and Felicia where she'd warned me to leave when I told her about smelling his cologne. Harrison took pictures of Richard's scratches on his arms and the bite mark on his hand where I'd fought back, and he wrote everything down in his notebook. That's when Mom showed up in the hallway and started talking really fast about how this was all a misunderstanding, and Richard was a good man who just wanted his family back. Harrison turned to her, and his face got really serious, and he told her to stop talking right now, or she'd be facing charges for false imprisonment since she'd locked me in that room. Mom's face went white and she stepped back, but then Dad appeared from around the corner and started yelling about how I was causing a scene and ruining everything. Harrison warned him too and said they could both be arrested for what they'd done, and that's when it hit me that my parents might actually face real consequences for locking me in with Richard. Richard was still sitting against the wall with the other officer watching him, and he started telling them that I attacked him first and showing them his scratches and the bite mark like he was the victim. But Ellie stepped forward again and told them exactly what she'd heard, including the timeline of when the hitting sound started and when I started screaming for help, which matched up perfectly with my recording. Harrison explained to me that since the restraining order was in Felicia's name and not mine, it made things complicated legally, but Richard could still be charged with assault, and my parents could be charged with unlawful imprisonment for locking that door. A woman in a business suit showed up, and Harrison introduced her as Cora Hernandez, who is a domestic violence advocate, and she sat down next to me on the bench. She had this calm way of talking that made me feel less alone, and she stayed with me while I gave my full statement to Harrison about everything that had happened from the moment my family started talking about Richard to when they locked me in that room with him. The officer stood Richard up and put handcuffs on him, and he started screaming that this was all Felicia's fault and that she'd ruined his life and turned everyone against him. They had to basically drag him down the hallway while he kept yelling and trying to pull away from them, and everyone in the other rooms had come out to watch what was happening. Mom started crying and saying we were tearing the family apart and destroying everything they'd worked so hard to build. Aunt Linda and Uncle Pete showed up from wherever they'd been hiding and went straight to Mom to comfort her without even looking at me or asking if I was okay. They formed this little circle around her like she was the one who'd been hurt while I sat there with butterfly bandages on my face and bruises forming on my throat. Cora stayed next to me the whole time and kept reminding me to breathe and that none of this was my fault no matter what my family said. The paramedics wanted to take me to the hospital to get checked out properly, but I didn't want to leave yet because I needed to make sure Richard was actually getting arrested and not just getting a warning or something. Harrison came back and told me they were taking Richard to jail for assault and drunk and disorderly conduct, and that the district attorney would decide about additional charges after reviewing all the evidence, including my recording and Ellie's witness statement. A woman in a suit walked up to me while the paramedics were checking my throat and introduced herself as Cora Hernandez from the district attorney's office. She sat down next to me on the bench and pulled out a tablet and started explaining that I could file for an emergency protective order right away and then get a permanent restraining order through the court. She showed me forms on her tablet and walked me through each section while I held an ice pack to my face. She wrote down her direct phone number on a business card and told me to call her anytime, day or night, if Richard tried to contact me again. The resort manager showed up about 20 minutes later with Bennett and Rowan from security and offered to move me to a different room on the other side of the resort immediately. Rowan went with me to the old room to pack my stuff while Bennett stood guard outside Richard's room to make sure he couldn't come back for his things. The manager upgraded me to a suite with better locks and gave me a special key card that would alert security if I used it in any emergency call box around the resort. I grabbed my phone once I was alone alone in the new room and texted Felicia that I was safe but hurt and that Richard had attacked me. She texted back immediately that she was already in her car driving here and would be there in 4 hours. She started sending me screenshots of old hospital records from when Richard had hurt her, before including x-rays of her broken ribs and photos of bruises around her neck. She sent police reports and medical records and told me to give everything to the prosecutor. Cora came to my new room about an hour later with a camera and started taking photos of every bruise and mark on my body. She had me save all the text messages from my family and Richard to a cloud drive and showed me how to make sure my voice recording was backed up in 3 different places. She took notes about everything that happened and had me write down a timeline of events while it was still fresh in my mind. My phone started blowing up with messages from the family group chat, and I saw Aunt Linda saying I was being dramatic and that Richard was just trying to talk to me. She said I overreacted and that calling the police was going too far, and now Richard might lose his job. Uncle Pete chimed in that I needed to drop the charges and handle this like a family. Mom said she was disappointed in me for causing such a scene. I took screenshots of every single message before I left the group chat because Cora had told me to document everything. Bennett knocked on my door the next morning to tell me that Richard had made bail already and technically had a restraining order that banned him from the resort property. But he warned me that Mom had asked for my new room number at the front desk and they had to give it to her since she was a registered guest too. He said security would keep an eye on things, but I should be careful. I went down to get breakfast around 9 and nearly dropped my coffee when I saw Richard sitting at the resort bar with a drink already in his hand. I went straight to the security desk and told them, but they said since the bar was technically a public area attached to the resort and not the resort property itself, they could only monitor him and couldn't make him leave unless he tried to enter the actual resort building. I decided to skip breakfast and headed back toward my room, but noticed Richard get up from the bar and start walking in the same direction about 30 feet behind me. I could hear his footsteps getting closer as we approached the stairwell, so I quickly turned into the crowded breakfast buffet area instead, where there were tons of people and witnesses. He followed me in, but stayed by the entrance watching me while I pretended to look at the food options. I stayed there for 20 minutes until a big tour group came in, and I was able to slip out while he got stuck behind them. I thought I was safe when I got to the elevator, but Richard appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks. He leaned in close and hissed that I was going to pay for getting him arrested and that nobody would believe me twice. I yanked my arm back and shoved him as hard as I could, and he went flying backward down the 3 stairs behind him. His ankle twisted badly when he landed, and he started yelling that I attacked him. My family came running from the breakfast area where they must have been eating, and Mom immediately rushed to help Richard up while Aunt Linda pointed at me and said she saw the whole thing. Uncle Pete was already on his phone, probably calling Richard's lawyer. But then 2 older ladies who had been waiting for the elevator spoke up and told Bennett, who had just arrived, that they saw Richard grab me first and that I was just defending myself. One of them had even started recording on her phone when she saw Richard following me. Bennett called Harrison back to the resort and took statements from both witnesses, while my family huddled around Richard, who was moaning about his ankle and saying he wanted to press charges against me for assault. Bennett took the witnesses' phones and started downloading the videos while Harrison called for backup to handle what was now becoming a bigger scene. Richard kept yelling about lawyers and lawsuits while my mom rubbed his back and shot me looks that could kill. The backup officers arrived within 10 minutes and started taking everyone's statements separately, pulling us into different corners of the lobby. I sat on a bench near the front desk while an officer wrote down everything I said about Richard following me and grabbing my arm. The 2 witnesses, both retired teachers from Ohio, gave their statements to another officer and showed him the video one of them had taken. You could see Richard's hand on my arm and me trying to pull away before the kick happened. Harrison reviewed the footage from the resort security cameras, but the angle wasn't great since we'd been partially blocked by a potted plant. Still, it showed Richard approaching me first and following me when I tried to leave. After about an hour of statements and reviewing evidence, Harrison walked over to Richard, who was still sitting on the floor with ice on his ankle. Richard making bail and showing up at the resort bar already drinking this early makes me really curious about who paid for that bail money and how he even knew where to find her when he supposedly wasn't allowed on the property. Harrison told him he was issued a formal trespass warning and needed to leave the property immediately. Richard started arguing, but Harrison cut him off and said he could either leave voluntarily or be arrested for trespassing. My family erupted in protests, but the officers weren't having it. They helped Richard to his feet and escorted him to his room to pack, while my parents followed behind, still complaining about unfair treatment. I went back to my room and locked the door, then texted Felicia that Richard had been kicked out. She called immediately, and I could hear her car engine in the background. She was already driving here, had been since I'd texted her earlier about smelling his cologne. She arrived 3 hours later, bursting into my room without even knocking since I'd given her my spare key card. We sat on the bed, and she was furious that I hadn't told her immediately when they'd mentioned Richard on day 1. I explained about trying to handle it and not wanting to ruin her friend's birthday, but she said that was stupid, and I should have known better. She was shaking as I told her about Mom locking me in the room with him and how they'd all been helping him get close to me. She kept saying she couldn't believe they'd do this, but we both knew that was a lie because they'd always chosen everyone else over us. The next morning, we went to the urgent care center in town because my wrist was swollen and purple from where Richard had grabbed me. The doctor was thorough, taking photos from multiple angles and measuring the bruises with a ruler for scale. She documented everything in detail, noting the finger-shaped bruises and the swelling pattern that clearly showed someone had grabbed me hard. The nurse gave me papers about domestic violence resources and asked if I wanted to file a police report, but I told her the resort security had already handled that part. They gave me a copy of all the medical records and photos on a USB drive for any legal proceedings. We drove straight from urgent care to the legal aid office that the nurse had recommended. The attorney, a tired-looking woman with stacks of files on her desk, listened to our story and looked at the evidence we had. She explained that getting a restraining order would take several weeks and might not automatically cover both of us since we were twins, and the court might see us as separate cases. She said Richard's lawyer would probably argue that I wasn't really Felicia, so the previous incidents didn't apply to me. We started filling out the paperwork anyway, because even a chance at protection was better than nothing. The forms were long and asked for every detail about every incident, which meant Felicia had to relive a lot of terrible memories. That evening, my phone buzzed with a long text from Mom blaming us for humiliating the family and ruining everyone's vacation. She said we were selfish and dramatic and that Richard was just trying to apologize and make things right. She accused me of assault and said I should be ashamed of myself for kicking a man who'd never laid a hand on me. I screenshot the message without responding and forwarded it to the attorney's email as more evidence of the family's priorities. Over the next few days, Richard started posting on social media about liars and false accusations and how some people just wanted to destroy good men. He never used our names, but it was obvious who he meant. Friends started texting us asking what was going on and if we were okay. We screenshot every post and comment he made, building our file of evidence. Felicia found posts where his friends were calling us crazy and saying we'd regret messing with him. We made our accounts private and blocked everyone connected to him, but people kept making new accounts to harass us. I couldn't stay at the resort anymore, so I packed my stuff and moved to a cheap motel on the other side of town, paying with my credit card and hoping Richard wouldn't find me there. Cora started checking in on me every day, bringing me food and helping me find a therapist who specialized in trauma. She helped me apply for victims assistance funds and connected me with a support group for domestic violence survivors, even though I kept saying it wasn't really my trauma to claim. A week later, Dad left me a voicemail saying I should apologize to keep the peace in the family and that I was being stubborn and childish. He said Richard was a good man who'd made mistakes and deserved forgiveness. He said I was tearing the family apart with my selfishness. I played the voicemail for the attorney at our next meeting, and she said it was perfect evidence of the family's pattern of enabling abuse and choosing the abuser over the victims. 3 weeks after the resort incident, we were finally in court for the restraining order hearing. Richard showed up in an expensive suit with a lawyer who probably cost more than I made in a month. We had our legal aid attorney who was juggling 5 other cases that same day. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the medical records, the witness videos, the social media posts, and the family's messages. Richard's lawyer argued that the twins were manipulating the system and that his client had simply wanted to have a conversation to apologize and seek closure. Our attorney presented Felicia's hospital records from when Richard had broken her ribs and the police reports from multiple incidents. The judge asked Richard directly about the social media posts, and he claimed they weren't about us at all, but about a different situation entirely. The judge didn't look convinced. After 2 hours of testimony and arguments, the judge granted a 2-year restraining order that covered both Felicia and me, though Richard's lawyer managed to negotiate some exceptions for what they called chance encounters at public events or mutual friends gatherings. The order said he couldn't come within 500 feet of our homes or workplaces, but if we happened to be at the same restaurant or store, he just had to leave rather than face arrest. It wasn't the complete protection we'd wanted, but it was something, and as small as it was, we had managed to win without letting him get away with it. Thanks for letting me wonder about all these twists and turns with you all. Hope my questions weren't too much. See you next time.